During my research about the Carroll County Fair history, I, I during the process of finding out and researching the paper for the Carroll record, I worked backwards from some actual dates that I had, like were in the 30s and late 20s, and worked my way back, and went through the same months, those summer months, July, August, September, and tried to find the dates or an article or something about the fair, because it was held in Taneytown, and I was able to find a continuous fair back to actually 1899. 1898, I could not find any reference of a fair in the paper, but the entrance sign, the welcome sign for fairs later, would say 1898. So I know at least they had it in 1898. But 1897 was the first actual gathering of a picnic for the Farmers Club, and it was at a Otterdale school, and they, after church, they had a picnic, and they had speakers from the university come to talk about the new farming methods and practices, and so that was a very successful picnic. And although I could not see anything in 1898, I assumed there was one there, because in 1899, and from then on, it continued, and it grew into it grew each year. It continued from that point on. I know there were other fairs earlier. I don't know that they were called the Carroll County Fair, or I know this one was the Taneytown Picnic. In the very beginning. The other ones I know there was reference to at the Historical Society. There was pamphlets here and there on some different exhibitions during the previous years, but I couldn't see any continuity in the continuous fair. So we started at 1897. If somebody else wants to find a better date, welcome to it, because this is the first time anything had been attempted at any kind of history. So, like what I said in the book, this is incomplete, and I asked anybody if there was any mistakes or any additions or corrections to please contact me. I had never heard anything from anybody yet. So.
Yeah, because somebody's like, we don't want to have to do it. Now, do you have any information about like the activities or what actually took place at that 1897 picnic? Like what they did?
Like I said, I think that basically it was just a picnic, and the local families brought in a smorgasbord of food, and they enjoyed the picnic and had speakers from the university. And there's probably a politician or two. You know, that was their venue anytime they could get. And farmers were better than 50% of the population then. So you met and saw a lot of people if you went to farmer events, if you're a politician. So I'm sure there was a politician or two there, and people from the university there speaking about how to have better farming methods.
Now, I had a question, too, because in the book it was talking about how they started out in the schoolhouse and then they followed the band to another spot, apparently. I wasn't quite clear on that.
See, when I did my notes, they were sketchy. You know, when my initial visit with the Carroll record, I wrote notes, and they were very sketchy notes, and I wasn't able to go back and fill in the blanks when I did the book. So all I had was my sketchy notes. And the Historical Society did not even have access to this paper, which is a real shame. They wanted to put it on film, and he would not even allow that at that time. Maybe things have changed since then. It's been 12 years, and I don't know that if somebody went and asked now if it would be available. and that would be a real treat to fill in the blanks. I think after the first couple of years, they built a welcome arch. It's the picture. There's a picture in the book, and it says welcome, and it says 1898 to, and I forget what year, 1904 or something. And they had the local bands. They actually made a little parade out of this, and they would march through this into the area. Maybe there was tent where there was speakers. Maybe there was maybe they were just under the trees, but they made an event out of it. In 1904, they changed the location of the fair from the schoolhouse / church to Oler's Grove, which was right along a railroad track. And being along the railroad track, the fair grew leaps and bounds because they could draw people from Pennsylvania and from the different areas of the county and Frederick. And so people would hop on the train and they'd come to the fair, and they would they had a marine milking machine, which was one of the first places where they exhibited one. And people would come to see how the milking machine worked. And they had entertainment. They had a high diving dog. I remember one of the elderly people in Taneytown that I interviewed years ago tell us that they remember seeing the dog. They didn't want to see the dog climb up the ladder, and he didn't want to see the dog fall down or dive down into the water. He just didn't have any desire to see that at all. But I think it was a 60-foot ladder. So, and that was my husband's 4-H leader, Mr. Hubert Knoll. He didn't want to see that, but he was old enough. He was in his teens when it was at Oler's Grove, so he could have seen it. But that was one of the, sideshows. I think they had a Ferris wheel, and people remember saving their pennies to get an ice cream cone at the fair. But they did. The inventors would bring their items there to show the farmers a new plow or a new milking machine or something like they do today. They try to sell them something so that they can make farming easier. They also eventually started having classes for the women, showing them, the university would show them how to can so that it was safer to preserve food for their families. And it just became something that was a very educational event for the adults and a fun event for the children. In 1917, Agent Grover Kinsey spent the whole week at the fair in charge of the speaking program. The manager of the fair that year was E.H. Schreiner. His quote was, "Every farmer with his family should attend from start to finish. It will be a summer school conducted at your door." And that's what these fairs were. One of the most interesting things I found when I was doing my initial research on the fair and their locations and such is that I saw where they had 7 acres of carriages, and that's how they counted their attendance. And I thought that was so interesting. I don't even know where you could put 7 acres of carriages now and then have a shade for the horses. But I thought that was very interesting. And even before it went to the railroad at Oler's Grove, they had a couple thousand people attend these. But like I said, the farming community was very strong and most of the population at that time. So they would come out in droves to try to learn something new. In 1911, the Maryland State Grange Picnic, which it was called at that time, had to be called a fair under law because they had exhibitors that came from out of state. And so it was still an association that was prime objective was to educate, and the Maryland State Grange and the University of Maryland did that, but because it did have outside exhibitors, it was to be called a fair. In 1923, they moved to another site in Taneytown to have the the fair, and they would run out of room at Eller's Grove. The railroad had been such a tremendous asset to the fair, getting people there, but the people were all there and they had no room to put all the exhibits that the people wanted to see, so they moved to a 141-acre tract on the other side of Taneytown. And at that time they had automobiles, so they weren't as dependent on the railroad. People would drive their automobiles to the fair. And they purchased, I think the fair board purchased that tract. They borrowed money from the bank. I think actually the fair board officers did it. I don't know that there was a fair association at that time. And somewhere along the way, there was a fair association, and there was stock, and that moved on into that. And I got bits and pieces of that, but there's a lot of blanks to fill in. And I actually had some minutes in the secretary minutes that were handed to us from the late 1930s, early 40s for about 3 years. So I did get a little bit of the more detailed records of the fair, but not enough. And if anybody had some of those old minutes, that would be fill in a lot of blanks on the actual financial runnings of the fair, because I think that was what eventually caused it to fail. They did borrow money initially for this. When it moved to Taneytown, they had a lot more room. They had a lot more place to have. They built a racetrack, which was not real popular with the townspeople. They didn't want betting. They did get the racetrack. They did have horse races there, sulky races. They had a lot of sideshows there. They had paid entertainment there. And there were many years when the gate, they charged admission, and when the gate money for the admissions didn't pay for the entertainment. You know, if you had bad weather, a hot week or a rainy week, or people just couldn't afford to come, or they just overextended themselves in the entertainment that they brought to the fair that didn't bring the people, it didn't work out. And then they, in the early 40s, they hit the war, and it was a bad situation for them at that time anyway, and they finally had to fold. But during the years, there were thousands of people that came to that fair. They exhibited, they learned. There was so much progress made at that time on teaching women how to be better mothers and better wives by having better canning methods. The university extension service came in and taught these women so many things that made their lives better. During this time, they experienced a tremendous amount of growth in facilities also. They had built a building they called the Fancy Building in Eller's Grove, and they moved that to the new Taneytown site. And that's where the exhibits were for canning and clothing and arts and crafts, and those type of exhibits were put into that building. And I think they had their demonstrations there too. But they also built a racetrack. They built a grandstand. They built horse barns. And this all took time and money and a lot of volunteers. So that added to the expense of the fair that they had to try to recoup. But they were good facilities. People enjoyed coming. And they did have a lot of exhibits at the fair. Another aspect of the fair was they would have public weddings there. And several couples would get married at the same time. And they started in 1933 and continued up into 1946. We actually, at the Centennial Fair, had a couple do their vows over again that had been married at the fair. And we had a new couple get married that year, and their family is very involved in 4-H now. So it continues. We're talking about the parade. In the very early research that I had, there was a parade. They had local bands come in, and it seemed to be a joyous way to start something. So they started with a parade, and that continues today. And I think that they've had one probably every year, rain or shine. And it's something the kids look forward to. The clubs participate. They want to showcase 4-H and the different, the variety of programs that 4-H offers. And so the kids work hard on it during their projects, during their club meetings, and they come to the fair and participate in the 4-H parade. And some years they have more bands than others, but the bands, I think, are still part of it. And I think that's a good tradition to get the fair started off. In the early years, the food was brought in by women. It was like a big smorgasbord. They would bring their best. And one of the articles I read, they had a 100-foot table full of food that they had brought in to one of the early picnics at the schoolhouse. Well, anytime you have good food, you're going to have a good gathering. And I'm sure the farm women are probably the best cooks in the country. I mean, they have the best products to use that come fresh from the garden, and that makes a big difference. And so I think the food was a good gathering point. And if you had good speakers, the farmers didn't fall asleep on you afterwards. But I think that's always been something that's been a drawing crowd for any fair, is the food. And over the years, when the fair moved to Ohlers Grove and then it moved into Taneytown, I'm sure that there was vendors there that had good food, just like there are vendors at many fairs that have good food. When the 4-H, in 1947, when the fair went to a 4-H fair, it went back to a volunteer type basis for food. I imagine there was probably a 4-H club that sold food at those earlier years, and then as it has grown now to have the kitchen is basically run by farm families at the fair now, and it's home cooked food. And some of the other booths are vendors, but they still have good food and good products, and a lot of them are raised right in Carroll County. When the fair moved from Taneytown to, well, actually from a fair association to 4-H in 1947, the volunteers really picked up the pace and wanted the 4-H program to continue on a county-wide basis, so that there was clubs could compete against each other on a county-wide basis rather than a community or club basis. So the 4-H agents and the club volunteers kept it going. They moved the fair to Pipe Creek that year, and they all pulled together and made it work. And from then on, it's been totally a 4-H fair, and it's been free admission since then.